This is a reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock deep into the wilderness, Moses came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The message of Yahweh appeared to Moses in a blazing fire from the midst of a thorn. Moses saw, the brush is ablaze with fire, and yet it isn't consumed. Moses said, "Let me go over and look at this remarkable sight and see why the bush doesn't burn." When Yahweh turned Moses coming to look more closely, God called out to him from the midst of the brush. "Moses, Moses," Moses answered, "Here I am." God said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your ancestors," the voice continued, "the God of Sarah and Abraham, the God of Rebekah and Isaac, the God of Leah and Rachel and Jacob." Moses hid his face, afraid to look at the Holy One. Then Yahweh said, "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries under those who oppress them. I have felt their sufferings. Now I have come to rescue them from the Egyptians, and to bring them out of their place of suffering to a place that is wide and fertile, a land flowing with milk and honey, the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have watched how the Egyptians are oppressing them. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out of the Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt?" God answered, "I will be with you, and this is the sign by which you will know that it is I who sent you. After you bring my people out of Egypt, you will all worship on this very mountain." But Moses said, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is this God's name?' What am I to them? What am I to them?" God replied, "I am as I am. This is what you will tell the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, Yahweh, the I am, the God of your ancestors, the God of Sarah and Abraham, the God of Rebekah and Isaac, the God of Leah and Rachel and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is the name you are to remember for all generations."
Zalmay Niazi, or Z, is an Afghan man who began working as a translator for U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan in 2007 when he was just 19 years old. You can imagine how dangerous the job was working in a war zone. He faced the same dangers as the military personnel without the benefits of the same equipment. In fact, he survived a gunshot wound to the arm and an IED attack that struck his leg. But even though he was afraid, he believed his work was important, not just for the U.S. and coalition forces, but for his homeland as well. "At first, it was very shocking, but I got used to it," Z said. "If I want to serve my country and the United States and appreciate their efforts in my country, I have to stay and I have to do this." When his translation work with the U.S. military ended, Z went to work for a private company in Afghanistan. And in late 2014, he traveled to the U.S. on a business trip. While here, he learned that a warning from the Taliban had been nailed to his parents' door. It said if he returned to Afghanistan, he and his entire family would be killed. The Taliban had already killed his uncle in retaliation for his work with the U.S., and he didn't want to risk more death. So Z filed for political asylum, and moved in 2015 to Iowa Falls, Iowa, to stay with a cousin who moved there after his own work as an interpreter for Iowa National Guard soldiers ended. Z has faced roadblocks in his asylum process. While the U.S. has a system in place specifically for people like him called the Special Immigrant Visa, designed to enable certain Iraqi and Afghan nationals to become U.S. lawful permanent residents. But the application process is complicated with red tape and paperwork. In 2021, Z was told his asylum application was denied and the U.S. planned to deport him. One reason cited was that he didn't face a real threat of persecution in Afghanistan. Well, as surprising as that was, it wasn't nearly as shocking as the other reasons cited in the decision. You see, Z was accused of providing material support to a terrorist organization when he, as a frightened 9-year-old, gave Taliban militants a piece of bread. They threatened to burn down his home and kill his parents if he didn't give them what they demanded. Hearing of his situation, the Iowa Falls community rallied around Z, who by that time had his own small handyman business and was involved in the community, volunteering with other refugees from Afghanistan and later from Ukraine. Supporters shared his story with the news media, reaching out to contacts in the federal government and raising over $45,000 for his legal expenses. The support and the love of the community got me to stand up again and go after the fight, he said. It kept me strong. I've been overwhelmed with the support and with the prayers. Javad Kazali, a St. Louis attorney who himself had worked for a decade in U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement at the Department of Homeland Security, asked that Z's case be re-examined. And as a result, a motion was filed to halt the deportation proceedings, and immigration officials were instructed to reconsider Z's application for political asylum. And just last year, in 2023, Z was finally granted political asylum, and someday he'll become a U.S. citizen. In our call to worship this morning, based on John chapter 21, verses 9 through 19, Jesus reiterated 3 times a summary of his call to disciples. Feed my sheep. Jesus was never truly the only liberator. In fact, the liberation work continued through the disciples, which raises a really important point. The work the disciples were called to do passes down generationally, which that means that we as Christians are called to that same liberating work. Feed my sheep serves as a reminder that liberation isn't just the work of liberating the oppressed. It's also work bound up in care and compassion for the suffering and the vulnerable. Feed my sheep. The people of Iowa Falls probably didn't make a connection between what was happening to Z and the complicated politics of his asylum request. For them, their call to liberate came from the relationship that they had with Z, which led them to organize together to help him stay in the U.S. and in their town. To feed sheep takes presence, patience, and a diligence of love. In Psalm 146, the psalmist lays out many of the ways they're praising a liberating God. They celebrate a God who feeds the hungry and gives justice to the oppressed. They strike an incredibly similar tone to the prophet Isaiah, who said, "The Spirit of God is on me because God anointed me to preach good news to the poor, heal the heartbroken, announce freedom to all captives, pardon all prisoners." Liberation is good news. And the psalmist proclaims that we worship a God who liberates. God sets captives free and gives sight to the blind. God lightens the load of the burdened and looks after those who are estranged or lost. God cares for orphans and the bereaved, those who are on the absolute lowest rungs of society. The psalmist centers God's divine work in the midst of helping real people with real problems. God worked through the people of Iowa Falls to keep Z liberated from the threat of usurpers in his own homeland, helping those Iowans to live out another way that the psalmist celebrates the liberating work of God. You protect strangers. And the reading from Exodus chapter 3 demonstrates that liberation doesn't happen in a vacuum. When Moses came to that burning bush to encounter the God who would liberate his people from Egypt, God's first words were to remark that they had heard the cries of their people in bondage. Liberation happens when people are listening for and responding to the cries of the oppressed. God heard the Israelites, and God went to action through Moses. And really, what a choice that was. Moses was a timid prophet. Of all the people God could have asked, God turned to a shepherd who was terrified of public speaking to be the one to raise up the voice of God to the Pharaoh of Egypt. We should never assume that only certain people might be called to do prophetic or courageous things. These days, we're being driven to believe that certain types of people are universally closed-minded and intolerant. But the story of a small town in Iowa, full of the kind of people often stereotyped as parochial and xenophobic, reminds us that so often we're wrong when we assume anything about God's beloveds. In fact, perhaps the only thing we should assume about God's beloveds is that everyone's capable of goodness. We'd have been wrong about Moses before he followed God's call. See what God can do with unexpected people. See what God did in Iowa Falls, uniting the hearts of a town to advocate for a person who comes from a place that we're taught to fear and distrust. You see, liberation actually works in two directions. Liberating the oppressed and liberating the oppressor from the soul-destroying beliefs that lead them to oppress. Z didn't necessarily want to leave his family and his homeland, but he found a promised land in Iowa Falls, Iowa, USA. His story is just one of so many throughout history of people who had to flee life-threatening situations. And even within our country and our own time, there are those who live with oppression and fear. May we widen our understanding of what we must do to continue God's work of liberation and co-creating a just world for all. Amen and amen.